Section 5, Issued Assets. One of the main features of Elements is the ability to issue your own assets. In this section, you'll learn how to issue your own asset, how to label it, how to make other nodes aware of it, and how to send some of the asset to another node. First, we'll need access to two Elements nodes, which we'll call E1 and E2. The nodes have had their blockchains reset and the default asset split between them. In other words, this is the same setup that we had in the previous section. So, just to show you what this looks like, we have two Elements nodes. One is called E1, which we will be accessing through E1 CLI. So we can just get the blockchain info on this node and see some information. And we also have a second Elements node called E2. So we can use E2 CLI to query that one. Perfect. Now we have information about the node E2. Let me just clear the screen. So, these two nodes are on the same local network, and they're connected to each other. Therefore, they share the same transactions in their transaction mempool, and they will have identical blockchains. Although they're running on the same machine, it's worth noting that they do not share the same actual blockchain files. Each node manages its own local copy of the blockchain, which contains the same transaction history, because they're in consensus and adhere to the same protocol rules as each other. Alright, let's start by checking each node's view of the existing asset issuances on the network. To do this, we can use the simply named list issuances command. So we can type E1 CLI list issuances. And this will show all the issuances that the E1 is aware of. Alright, we can see here that there are two issuances on E1. One of these is actually the initial Bitcoin issuance on the network. When I configured this, I set it to 21 million. The second one is one that I did before I started this tutorial. But if we look at E2's issuances with the same list issuance command, we can actually see that it has the same issuances listed. You can see it has this asset issued, and it also has the same amount of the Bitcoin asset noted. Alright, so what we've seen here is that both nodes show the same issuance history. So this asset's hexadecimal string here, B2E, etc., is the ID of the asset. It's worth noting that the default asset is, not only is it assigned an ID, it's also automatically assigned this label of Bitcoin. However, when you issue your own asset, you can set this label yourself. So we're going to do that shortly. But before we can do that and try out a bunch of cool stuff, first we have to actually issue our own asset. So let's go ahead and do that. The command for issuing an asset is actually called issue asset. So in order to do this, we will run E1 CLI issue asset, and we'll provide a few arguments to this command. One of those is the amount of the asset. If you want to see if you want to see what all these arguments mean, you can just type the command yourself and you will get this helpful help screen here. Now let's type E1 CLI issue asset. And this issue asset command has three parameters we care about here. The first one is the amount of the asset to issue. So let's type 100 for that. We'll have 100 of this new asset. The next one is the amount of tokens to create. And tokens are actually used to reissue amounts of an asset. So for that, let's create one reissuance token. And the final parameter tells Elements to either create the asset issuance as blinded or unblinded. Here, we will set it to false. So we'll use an unblinded issuance since we want to be able to view the issuance amounts from E2, which we'll do in a minute. All right, let's run that. First, let me just clear the screen before I run that. All right. So we run that, and then we get a bunch of data returned about the issuance. These include the transaction ID, the unique hex value of the asset, and the unique hex value of the asset's token. All right, let's actually generate a block to confirm this issuance transaction, which is currently just in our mempool. So we will type E1 CLI generate 1 for one block. Perfect. Now, after generating that block, we can run E1 CLI list issuances one more time. And as you can see, previously we actually had 2 assets in this list. But now we have 3. And the third one is, here it is. This is the issuance that we just created. Here we can see that there are 100 of this asset, which we just issued, and 1 reissuance token. Note that here we can see the hex value of this asset, but we don't see a label like we do for the Bitcoin one. However, we will set this soon enough. But first, before continuing, keep in mind that this was what the E1, our first Elements instance, is seeing. Let's take a look at what the second Elements instance we're running, E2, is seeing. So E2 CLI list issuances. So despite this issuance transaction being confirmed, we can see that E2 only actually sees 2 issuances, which is what it saw at the very start of this tutorial. This shows us that E2 is not aware of the asset issuance that E1 made. It can only see the initial issuance of Bitcoin, which it could already see, along with this other asset that I had issued previously. It's worth noting that even though E2 cannot see the issuance itself, E1 could still send E2 some of this new asset. The new asset would then show up as an available balance in E2's wallet, even though E2 is not aware of the original issuance. However, in order for E2 to be able to see this actual instance, let me restart that part. However, in order to enable E2 to see the actual issuance, along with the amount issued, we will need to add the address to E2 as a watched address. So, in order to do this, we first need to find out the address that the asset was sent to. Alright, for this we can use the transaction ID that was listed earlier when we created this issuance. So let's scroll up and copy that transaction ID. Alright, I have it copied here to my clipboard. Next, what I'll need to do is type in E1 CLI, and what we'll need is the address. And to do that, we have to first what we need here is the address that was used in this issuance transaction. So we can do this by getting the transaction information from E1 with E1 CLI get transaction, and I'll paste in this transaction ID from earlier. And here we see this big hex blob. But if we scroll up, at the top here, we will see various information about this issuance transaction. Oops. All right. There are a lot of outputs here, and the one we really care about is this one. You can see here that the amount is 100. So this output corresponds to the issuance of the asset. So let's take the address used here and copy that. And let's import this address into E2 using the import address command. And if we do this, hopefully E2 should actually be able to see this issuance as well. So let's type E2 CLI import address and paste that address. Perfect. Now let's type E2 CLI list issuances. Now we can actually see 3 issuances on E2. And the third one we see, so we see the initial issuance I made before the tutorial with an asset of amount 5. We see the initial 21 million Bitcoin issuance, and we also see this new issuance of 100 of an asset, which is the one that we just made. So that's super exciting. Now both of the Elements nodes are able to see this issuance. Keep in mind that the E2 Elements node is able to see this 100 asset amount because the issuance transaction was unblinded. But if we set that argument that we used previously here, let me scroll up my bash history and you can see here that if we set this to true, the issuance would have been blinded and E2 would be unable to see this asset amount used in the issuance. All right. Now let's try to set a label for this asset. So we can do this by typing E1 CLI stop. So first we have to actually stop the Elements instance and reboot it with the asset label provided. So let's do that right now. First we actually need the asset label, which is this one. So the asset ID. So let me copy this asset ID. And then I'll type E1 DAE, which is the alias I've assigned to my Elements instance of E1. And I will provide the asset dir argument. And for that, I will first paste the asset ID. Then I will put a colon. And then I will put the name of this new asset, which I want my Elements node to remember. My name is James, so let's call this James token. Keep in mind that this is one way to provide the label, but we can also provide the label to the node in the elements.conf file. However, this way is easier, so we are just going to do it for now, like this in this tutorial, to keep it simple. Okay, let's launch E1 with this new label provided. Now, let's query it with E1 CLI and see the issuances. Now, right away, we can see that this issuance of 100 actually now has a label, which is James token. So that's cool. We have now assigned a label to it, and it makes it easier to reference this asset when doing things on the node, which is quite exciting. Let's check out what E2 is seeing right now. So E2 is seeing still the same thing. It doesn't have a label assigned. And E2 doesn't have this label because labels are only available to the node that set them. It's a local thing. Indeed, we can assign a different label to the same asset hex on E2, but to do that, first we're going to have to follow the same process. All right, so let's restart E2 with a different label for this asset. So first, let's stop the node. And now let's restart it. So we'll run the same command from earlier, which was this one. E1, So this is the same command from earlier. However, instead of launching E1, we now want to launch E2. We provide the same asset hex, but for the label, let's label this asset on E2 as something else, since these labels are just local to the node. So let's assign the label of, how about instead of James token, We call it strange token. Cool. So we've launched the node. Let's run E2 CLI list issuances. And here we can actually see that this asset with an issuance of 100 has been assigned the label of strange token. Asset labels are local to each node, like I mentioned, so we can query E1 again and see what it still thinks the asset is called. Oops. I spelled issuances wrong. All right. Perfect. So E1 still sees it as James token. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, the mapping of label to asset hex is useful when carrying out actions, such as transactions and wallet balance queries, because it allows a shorthand way to refer to an asset. For example, well, let's clear the screen first. All right, so we'll use the command get new address. So that's E2 CLI get new address. Here we have a new address. And then we'll use the send to address command. And the way this will look is from E1, we'll type E1 CLI, send to address. We'll put the address here in 1 second. We'll send 10 of this token from E1 to E2. And there are many other arguments here. I won't go into what they mean right now, just to keep this tutorial concise. However, you are welcome to read the documentation for the send to address RPC and learn all about these arguments. But for now, let's just assume that's what we want. The final argument, I will tell you, that is the asset ID. So let's paste that in. And now that we've gotten that out of the clipboard, we can copy and paste this address here. So let's do that. All right. Now, before I execute this command, let's just summarize what it's doing. So we've gotten a new address from E2 without using any labels, just using the raw hex ID here. We're now going to send 10 of this asset to that address. All right, let's execute this command. Perfect. So it now returns the transaction ID of this new transaction, which sends the asset. Let's confirm this transaction by generating a block with the generate command. Perfect. Now let's see if the asset was received on E2. So let's do E2 CLI get wallet info. And right here we can see E2 lists that it has received 10 of this strange token asset, which is exactly what we tried to do. So this asset was indeed received. This was a bit complicated because we had to keep that asset hex copied and pasted in. So let's try doing the exact same thing, but this time we can use the actual label of the asset to simplify our life a bit. So we'll execute the exact same command. So from E1, we will send 10 of this token to that same address from E2. However, this time, instead of referring to the asset using the asset ID, we will just type E1's label for this asset. So if you recall, we named this on E1 James token, named after me. So let's type James token here and let's send that. All right, so we sent James token and we did not call it strange token because E1 still thinks this asset is called James token and E2 thinks it's called strange token. So let's check the wallet info on E2. Oh, oops, first we have to actually confirm this transaction. So let's generate a block with E1 CLI generate 1. And now we can actually view the wallet information and we can see, very cool, now we have 20 of this asset on E2. That's pretty cool. We sent to E2 using this custom defined label, and that really made using elements a lot easier. All right, let's quickly summarize. In this section, we've seen how to issue and label assets. In the next section, we will look at reissuing and destroying amounts of an issued asset. See you then.